The United States Federal Marshals Service was created in 1789, the same year the Constitution was ratified. It is the nation's oldest federal law enforcement agency, and during its first 100 years of existence, it operated under an assumption so profound that it practically didn't need to be stated that the law belonged to white men, that justice had a specific skin color, that a star and a gun were tools forged only for certain hands. But between 1875 and 1910, a man walked through Indian Territory, what is today Oklahoma, who violated that assumption at every step of his horse. His name was Bass Reeves. He was born enslaved. He would die having captured more than 3,000 criminals. He would pursue men through a territory so vast and wild that it swallowed entire regiments of cavalry. He would do this alone, in the darkness, carrying the weight of a history that wanted to see him dead, and a present that wanted to see him invisible. This is not a story about a hero who overcame his past. This is a story about a man who was remade by it, about what freedom really costs, about the moment when a person stops being a victim of circumstances and becomes responsible for everything he does after that, about the kind of redemption that doesn't look like peace. It looks like a purpose that erodes and consumes. It looks like a gun. It looks like duty. It looks like a man riding in darkness that breaks other men and choosing to be the one who brings light anyway. The world that created Bass Reeves was built on a lie so complete, so total, that it became invisible. In the 1830s and 1840s, slavery in America was not some ancient relic or a practice that civilized men admitted in private. It was the economic engine of an entire nation. It was woven into banks and commerce, in cities and fields, in written laws and assumptions that no one needed to write. A man could be property. The Constitution said so, not in those exact words, but in mathematics that everyone understood. 3/5 of a person minus 2/5, less breath, less soul, less future. Bass Reeves was born around 1838 in Parker County, Texas. His parents were enslaved. He grew up not on a plantation in the deep South, but on the frontier, a land still not completely tamed. His owner was a man named George Reeves, and he kept him as property on the edge of a world that was still being contested, still being lost and reclaimed with each season. The frontier was paradoxical. It was harder than the deep South in many respects, but also stranger. The laws were thinner. Power was more visible. A man's worth was sometimes measured less by his race than by his ability to ride, his courage, his usefulness in that vast, relentless territory. And yet the fundamental truth did not change. Bass Reeves did not own himself. His body, his time, his future, all of this was legal property of another man. He existed in one of America's cruelest paradoxes. He was human in every way that mattered. He thought, suffered, felt fear, resisted, desired. But he was legally, documentally, constitutionally something different. An object, a tool, a fraction. For 28 years this was the sum of his world. There is no epic narrative in that. There is no great drama. It was just dust every day. Work every day, the same fence every day, the same impossibility every day. Named but never really recognized. Alive but not really counted. Strong enough to work but not free enough to leave. And then, in 1861, something broke across the entire continent. The Civil War began like lightning through dry wood. Everything that had been fixed and immutable began to give way. The owners departed for war. Men were drafted, enlisted, fled. And in the chaos of that war, Bass Reeves made a choice that would define everything that came after. The stories vary about exactly how this happened. Stories always vary when no one was there to write things down. Some accounts say he simply left when his owner went to war. Others say he went with him, serving the Confederate forces, and then disappeared during combat on some dark field. What matters, what is certain, is this. At some point between 1862 and 1863, Bass Reeves ceased to be enslaved, ceased to be property, ceased to be a fraction. At that moment, when he walked out of that life, he was free. But freedom, when it comes to you violently and suddenly, without warning, without preparation, without a safety net, freedom is a different thing from peace. Freedom is the opposite of protection. Freedom is being alone. He moved north. He found his way in Arkansas and then beyond into Indian Territory. He worked as freedmen did when they could find work. He learned the land. He married Nellie Factor, a woman who had been born free. He built something that resembled a life. There was something that looked like peace in those years. But peace built on newly gained freedom is always fragile. And then, more than a decade later, when the blood of war had dried and the country was trying to pretend everything made sense, Bass Reeves understood something that changed everything. He understood that freedom without purpose was just a different kind of prison. That being alive was not the same as being alive for something. That a man who was broken could be reassembled, rebuilt, remade, but only if that man chose to participate in his own reconstruction. And he had decided. In 1875, at 37 years old, Bass Reeves walked to Fort Smith, Arkansas. He walked to the office of Judge Isaac Parker, a man who had been called the hanging judge, because he had ordered more hangings than any other federal judge in American history. A man who had dedicated his entire life to bringing law to Indian Territory, that vast region of wild land and chaos that was the last refuge of every man that the law had failed to catch. And Bass Reeves, a black man who had been born in chains, looked at that white judge and said he wanted to be a federal marshal. Most accounts say Parker simply said yes. Here was a man who knew the territory, who understood how to survive in it, who was loyal. Color meant nothing to a judge who needed results. And Bass Reeves received his commission, his badge, his authority. This is the moment where the myth wants to begin. This is where the story wants to transform into something clean and comforting. A man emerges from chains to serve justice. A man transcends his suffering to become a symbol, resolves something, redeems something. But the real story of Bass Reeves is much harder than that. It is heavier than any comfortable redemption. It is made of choices that don't erase the past. They only commit you to a completely different and unforgettable future. When Bass Reeves became a federal marshal, he was given a jurisdiction that no competent white lawman had voluntarily accepted. Indian Territory was what remained. It was the last refuge of criminals that no living man could reach. Escaped slaves, murderers, thieves, men fleeing blood feuds and vengeance, men who had killed, stolen, disappeared. They fled west because west was where the law died. It was a place so vast that a man could ride for a week and not see another human being, so empty that you could die and nobody would ever know where your body fell. The wind would find it before any person. And Bass Reeves rode into that nothingness, alone. For 35 years, he would operate in that territory. Eventually, he would cover a jurisdiction that included parts of what is today Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas, an area of approximately 75,000 square kilometers of land that could kill him in various ways. He would pursue men through canyons. He would track them across deserts. He would negotiate with tribes of American Indians who had their own laws and did not recognize federal authority. He would capture more than 3,000 criminals. He would engage in more than 100 armed confrontations. He was shot so many times that his hat and his coat became like sieves, riddled with bullet holes in patterns that seemed impossible. He kept them, he wore them, a living demonstration. But none of this was simple. None of this could avoid being complicated by what he was. And this is what you need to understand. Bass Reeves was a black man enforcing federal law in a South that still burned with rage at having lost the war. This means he had the legal authority to arrest white men. It means he could enter their properties. It means he could give orders for them to lie on the ground. It means there were thousands of white Southerners whose entire worldview told them that no black man could have that authority over them, that it was a cosmic inversion of the natural order, that it was an affront to be touched by him, a violation to be arrested by him, a desecration to be under his command. And yet he did exactly that. For 35 years he did exactly that. He walked onto the property of white men and arrested them. He brought them in chains before judges. He testified against them. He did this knowing he was a black man in a land that hated him for being free, knowing that he was doing this at a time when the entire country was working legally and culturally to restore the hierarchies that slavery had built. To say again that a black man's place was underneath. One of his first assignments was to arrest his own cousin, a man named Jim Webb, for the murder of a white man. Reeves tracked his blood. He found him. He captured him. He brought him before justice. He did this knowing what his cousin would feel, knowing what his family would think, knowing that he had crossed a line from which he could never step back. But the law he had chosen to serve did not allow him to make exceptions based on blood or fear or the safety of his own body. The law did not ask for compassion. It asked for justice, and he had decided to be the instrument of that justice. He became legendary in Indian territory. But legend, when you are a black man in a country that has not yet accepted your existence as a man, is a profoundly dangerous thing. It means everyone knows your face. It means everyone knows what you can do. It means criminals have time to prepare for you, to hide, to kill you. And it means you carry something that most of the white marshals around you do not carry: the certainty that if the law fails, if civilization disappears, if the system turns its back, you will be completely alone. No support of race, no assumption of protection, no tribe. You will be a man in a desert, and the desert has already tried to kill you once. In 1884, Bass Reeves was assigned to a pursuit that would demonstrate everything about how he had learned to live in that impossible space. A man named Dan Smith had murdered a black woman named Jenny. Smith was an experienced killer. He had killed before. He fled to the depths of Indian territory, to the places that even other marshals did not dare go. Reeves followed. He tracked Smith for days, then weeks. He traveled through country so harsh that his horse went lame, unable to continue. On foot, sleeping on bare ground, eating what he could find, game meat when he had ammunition, roots when he didn't, drinking from water he found, which could be dirty, which could kill him. And he got closer and closer to his prey. He could feel the closeness. He could feel that man ahead of him the way a predator can feel the next. And then, somewhere where no one was watching, where no one could testify, where there were only two men and the vastness of Indian territory, Bass Reeves found Dan Smith. What happened at that moment is lost. There are no witnesses. There are no reliable documents. The official account said it was a legitimate confrontation. Two armed men in a fair fight. And perhaps it was. Bass Reeves was an extraordinary marksman. He could have easily won. But what matters is this: Bass Reeves understood at that moment, in a way that most men never understand, what the law really is. The law is not a philosophy. The law is not abstract. The law is the will of men with guns, enforced at the exact moment in the darkness, when no one is watching. And if you are a black man enforcing that will against white men and black men alike, you need to be willing to be harder than they are, faster, more relentless. You need to be willing to make choices that will never be completely understood or justified. And you need to be willing to live with it. Smith was shot and killed. The body was brought back. The law was served. No one asked many questions. No one needed to. During the 1880s and 1890s, Bass Reeves continued. He brought murderers and thieves. He pursued men through snowstorms that blocked vision and droughts that burned like fire. He lived in the saddle of his horse. It was where he spent most of his life. He aged in the field while riding. His face grew wrinkled. His body grew tired. But he continued, because stopping meant the world had won, that the life he had chosen was a lie. And all that time, the world around him was changing in ways that no one had planned. The frontier was closing. Indian territory was being tamed, systematized, brought into civil law. Railroads were built. Cities arose where there had been only dust. The wild territory became respectable, and as the frontier closed, something began to happen to Bass Reeves that is often left out of stories about heroes. The system that had given him authority began to marginalize him. As Indian territory became more established, as important people began to care about appearances, the presence of a black federal marshal became harder to explain, more embarrassing. Younger white marshals began to receive the better assignments. Reeves was increasingly sent for the dangerous jobs, the jobs that no one else wanted to do. The work did not diminish, but recognition withered like a plantation in drought. In 1902, after 27 years serving as a federal marshal, Bass Reeves was forced to retire. He was 64 years old. His health was collapsing. Diabetes was beginning to consume his body. Indian territory had become a place where he was no longer necessary, or perhaps more precisely, where his usefulness had been completely extracted and now could be discarded. He died on January 12, 1910, in Fort Smith, Arkansas. He had captured more than 3,000 criminals in his life. He had engaged in more armed confrontations than any other federal marshal in American history. He had ridden alone through territory that had broken entire men, that had left them mad or dead or empty. He did this as a black man in a law enforcement system that was made for white men. He did this knowing with certainty that history would not remember him, that he would be forgotten, that his name would disappear, and he did it anyway. What does it mean to live in a world that is fundamentally, legally, constitutionally arranged against you, not in abstraction, not in theory, in concrete reality, every day, in every document you sign that says you are less, in every law that says how you can travel, where you can stay, with whom you can speak? What does it mean to accept that reality, not because you like it, not because you understand it, but because there is no alternative, and then choose to work within it, not to change it? You cannot change the law when the law is against you, but to serve it, to be an instrument of that law, to place your own authority in service of something that did not protect you, that hurt you, that discriminated against you. What does it mean to be used as a tool of civilization, necessary in the moment when no one else can do the work, and then be set aside when you are no longer needed, when civilization becomes respectable enough to no longer need you? These are the true questions that the life of Bass Reeves places before us. Not pleasant questions, not questions that have comfortable answers, questions that make his story much heavier than any simple narrative of triumph or overcoming. We live in an age that is hungry for stories of redemption. We want to believe that a man can be broken, completely, totally, irreversibly broken, but that he can choose to rebuild himself. That suffering can be transformed into purpose, that a life that begins in chains can end in freedom. And all of these things are true about Bass Reeves. He was enslaved. He freed himself. He served justice. He would die free. But what his story really reveals is something much more disturbing and much deeper. Redemption is not about becoming a better version of your past. Redemption is about choosing a future that matters, especially even, when the world will not recognize that you did it. Redemption is about accepting that the pain you suffered will not be compensated, will not be justified, will not be washed clean. but that you can transform it into something that means something anyway. Redemption is not freedom. Redemption is responsibility. When Bass Reeves walked out of Indian territory enslaved and into it as a federal marshal with a star, he was not escaping his past. He was carrying it every day, every pursuit, every armed confrontation, every moment when he had authority over a white man and had to use that authority, knowing the world wanted to see him dead for it. Every choice he made was made by a man who knew what it meant to be owned, to be powerless, to be legally less than human, and that knowledge never left him. It informed every decision, every risk he took, every man he pursued, every power he exercised. He knew the weight of chains, and because he knew that weight, he could recognize it in others, and he could choose to bring justice to them too. The true cost of his freedom was not the price he paid in chains, though it was real and terrible. The true cost was the price he paid every day after that. It was living in a world that wanted him to forget what chains felt like, while simultaneously ensuring, legally, culturally, constantly, that he could never be completely free of them. It was living in that impossible space between emancipation and equality, in that chasm between what the law said, you are free, and what culture whispered, you are less. And he chose to serve that law anyway, not because it was perfect, not because it would protect him, not because the world would recognize him, but because it was the only law that existed, and someone had to enforce it, and he had decided it would be him. In the end, Bass Reeves was not a hero who transcended his circumstances. Hero is too small a word, too easy, too comfortable. Bass Reeves was a man who accepted his circumstances, the worst circumstances a man could inherit, and then did something much greater with them. He took the worst hand that America could deal him, slavery, racism, hate, invisibility, and used it to serve the only thing that could potentially redeem America itself. Not freedom, not equality. Freedom and equality did not yet exist. He served that which could one day open the way for them, the rule of law, not the law as it was perfect, pure and just, but the law as it was possible, incomplete, imperfect, and yet infinitely more worthy of serving than the chaos that came before. That is why his story matters, not because it is inspiring, not because it makes us feel good about ourselves or about our country, but because it is true in a way that most stories never manage to be. True in a way that breaks us a little if we really pay attention. Bass Reeves died without seeing the world he defended change to recognize his existence. He died as a black man in a country that was still, with rigid legality and relentless consciousness, arranging itself to ensure that black men like him had no real place in its future. Retired, forgotten, sick. But in those 35 years in which he rode alone through Indian territory, in those more than 100 confrontations, in those 3,000 arrests, in that dust he breathed, and in that silence he endured, in that isolation that no one could truly understand. He demonstrated something that history could not erase, that time could not dissipate, that a man can be born in chains and live free. Not free as the world defines freedom, without fear, without limitations, without pain, but free as it is really possible to be free, responsible for yourself, significant, worthy, unshakable. The dust of Indian territory has long since settled. The frontier has been sealed. The cities that grew in wild land were forgotten and grew again. Cycles repeat themselves. But in some part of that dust, in the wind that has blown through those prairies for more than 1 century, there exists the memory of a man who rode alone, a man who carried justice into darkness, a man who was born a slave and died a federal marshal, a man who understood, in the deepest way that a human being can understand, what it really costs to be free, and who chose to pay that price anyway.